Out of those, how many of the things that were needed to go from the before to the after haven't we talked about? So I'm going to just choose a few of these selectively and show you a few of the issues that we haven't gone through yet. Oh, that's the after. I got to grab the before. One thing I should mention that I failed to do with earlier is there's a keyboard shortcut where when you're in Bridge, it will send you to Photoshop without opening a picture. It just means, oops, I didn't mean to go to Bridge. Take me back to Photoshop. Or if you're in Photoshop, it sends you to Bridge. Just think it sends you to the other. Whichever one you're in, it sends you to the other one. And that is Shift-Command-O on a Mac. That would be Shift-Control-O in Windows. O is for open. So when you're in Photoshop, think about opening a file. And the normal keyboard shortcut for open is Command-O. That would give you the open dialog box, which is not that useful because you don't get great looking previews in it. So you're just adding the Shift key to the standard keyboard shortcut that's available for most applications, that is Command-O for open. You're just adding Shift. So Shift-Command-O, I'm in Photoshop, sends me over to Bridge. Or if I'm in Bridge, I'm going, oh man, I didn't need something from Bridge. I type it again, I'm back to Photoshop. It's just one that's nice to know about. All right, so here we have an image that's crooked. And I might have also tilted my camera slightly. And so let's see how we can fix some of those. Well, first off, in the tools up here, we have the crop tool. Right next to the crop tool is something that's supposed to look like a bubble level. It might be the kind of little tiny bubble level you'd set on the top of a grandfather's clock and level it. Well, if you click on that, now you can move your mouse on top of your image in Camera Raw. Click on something that should be horizontal. I'm clicking near the left side of the top of that building. And then drag to the right side and get this line that you're creating to line up with that top edge. And when you let go, it will become horizontal. At least the cropping rectangle will be rotated until it's that way. You're only going to see the end result when you switch out of this tool and over to like the hand tool. Well, while we're still in the cropping rectangle, in this case, I'm going to crop out any distractions. So in the top, do you see the windows that are up there? They're black for the most part, dramatically darker than their surroundings. My eye is going to be pulled to those, especially if they're at the edge of your frame. Anything in the edge of the frame that's a distinctly different brightness, your eye is going to be pulled there. It's especially true in the corners. If you ever have anything diagonals in your corners, your eye can't help but look. So I try to crop it out. Here, there's just a slight detail on the edge, some little badge that's on the wall. Crop out. I wish I could crop out that video camera, but I'd have to cut into the building, and I don't want to. But do you see this dark edge coming down there, where it's like the edge of the building? I got to pull that in. And at the bottom, there's nothing of interest down here. This is what I would call dead space. And if it's dead space, I don't want a lot of it, unless that's really part of the purpose of the photo, is it's primarily dead space with one little interesting part. But I'll pull that up and get rid of, there's a little hatch down there. I'll pull in like that. Now when I move away to the hand tool, we got that straightened out. Now there are other methods we can use this with, because with that, all it was doing was rotating the picture. And what I had done was, went to the tools up here at the top. It was this tool here. That's the one that's supposed to look like a level that's got a little bubble of air in it that you can see. But that's not all that's sophisticated. All it's doing is rotating. So I'm going to clear my cropping. I'll go over here to the crop tool, click and hold down on it, say clear crop, and let's look at a different method we could use. On the right side of my screen, where we have all these sliders, remember there's all these tabs, and so far we've only looked at the basic tab. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in here. It's really like a whole program. It's robust what they have. This icon here is supposed to look like the glass elements that make up the inside of your lens. You ever seen a lens sawed in half and you can see the glass elements inside? That's what that's supposed to look like, a lens sawed in half. If I click on it, that's the Lens Corrections tab. And there's a checkbox under there called Enable Lens Profile Corrections. That's a good checkbox to turn on. What happens is your lenses will cause straight lines in your image to become bent lines. They'll either bend in towards the middle of the frame or they'll bend out towards the outside of the frame, depending on what kind of lens you have. And that's known as pincushion or barrel distortion. And if I turn on this checkbox, if the lens I'm using is a common one, like it's made by Nikon, Canon, Sony, one of the common brands, then Adobe has tested most of those lenses. And what they did is they just pointed the lens at a grid, and they saw how did the grid get distorted. Did it bend inward on the edges or outward, and by how much? And they created a profile. All that means is a text file that describes how that particular lens distorts things. And so they tried to come out with this profile that simply described how does your lens bend things, how extreme does that do it. And by turning this on, it tries to correct for it. So I'll turn that on. You'll see a slight change in the image. It's mainly trying to straighten things that were slightly crooked, and it tells me here what brand of camera it read from the metadata, the text attached to my file, what lens it thought it used, and then that it had a profile or a description of how that lens distorts things. So it just plopped that in there. If these were not filled in, I could manually click on it and say, well, you don't recognize what lens I have, so I'm going to tell you it was a Canon. And I'm going to tell you it was this particular Canon lens. And then it can use the associated profile, even though it couldn't read it out of the file somehow to figure it out. But only common lenses will be in there. One of the other things it does is it corrects for what's called vignetting. Vignetting is where your lens can't deliver as much light to the corners of the frame as it can to the middle, where the corners or edges, as you get towards those corners, are darker than the center of the frame. And so turning on that checkbox will brighten up the corners of your images to make them the same brightness as the center of your image, if that's a problem your lens has. Sometimes I actually like the fact that the corners of my image are darker than the middle because it keeps somebody's attention towards the middle of the frame. And so there is a slider here called Vignetting. And when it's in the middle, it's set to 100%, which means give 100% of what Adobe thinks is needed to correct for the problem with your lens. If I bring it down, usually I would notice that the corners of my image get a little bit darker, but it depends on how bad your lens is. Sometimes it won't be all that dramatic of a change. If you look in the bottom of this image when I bring it down, can you see the bottom corners getting a bit darker? That means that's what my lens gave me, and if I put this back to the middle, that's a corrected version. Now, when they created those profiles, they only tested one lens of that exact model. And you might have a lens that was made 10 years later. It's the same model of lens, but it's 10 years later, and it might have changed since they created that. So you could push this even further into the positive, which means go more than what it thinks it needs to overcorrect for it. You shouldn't usually need to do that, but if you notice that one of your lenses seems to not get compensated for enough. The other thing is you could turn the distortion slider down to 0, and that means don't correct for distortion. I like that the lines in my image are bending outward or inward. When would you want that? Well, if you have an image that was shot with a fisheye lens. A fisheye lens makes it so any horizontal lines, as they get closer towards the edge of the frame, they bend more and more out. And when you turn on that checkbox at the top, it will straighten out a fisheye lens where there is no distortion. And you might have wanted that distortion because you like the look of it. That's why most people buy a fisheye lens. And if that's the case, you could turn on that checkbox and then turn the distortion slider all the way down. And it would say only correct for the darkening of the corners. Don't correct for the bending that the lens puts in. So just so you know, that's what that is. So in general, that's not a bad thing to turn on. And if you happen to not like it when it brightens up the corners, just turn down the vignetting slider to prevent that. Now, there are other tabs underneath here for color and manual. Let's take a look at those. Under the Color tab, there is a checkbox here called Remove Chromatic Aberration. And that's another problem with lenses. What happens with lenses is, have you ever seen white light being sent through a prism? And when it comes out the other side of the prism, you get like a spectrum of color coming out, or it divides it into different colors. Most people have seen that at some point on like a science show on TV or something. Well, when you send light through the various elements, glass elements in your lens, a similar thing happens, just to a lesser extent. And so instead of getting the white light to be focused exactly where it is, in some areas it separates a bit. And you'll start to see it in some of your images. I'm not sure how obvious it is here, but I'm going to zoom up and I'm going to look usually closer to the edges of the frame. I'll see it more. You're going to see it as a color halo around the edges of things where there would be high contrast. Like if you had a wrought iron fence, where it's a black fence on a blue sky, the difference in brightness between those two would be tremendous, and right around the edge you would see something. Now here it's much more subtle on this particular image, but right here I can see a reddish, magenta-ish, kind of glowy thing, and right here I can see a greenish one. If I turn on this checkbox, let's see if they go away. Yeah. Now, just in case you can't see it, can you see it now, this little reddish thing? Unfortunately, I don't know how to turn this on while you're still zoomed up, but now if I zoom up, you don't see it there. Right? That's a checkbox that wouldn't be a bad thing to have turned on pretty much every image, because when would you not want to get rid of those little colored halos? I never see that as being a positive thing in my images. So remove chromatic aberration. If you ever notice little reddish, greenish, or purplish halos around the edges of crisp objects, then that's the checkbox right there designed to get rid of them. The stuff down below is if you have further problems where even after turning that on, you can see purple or green halos still left over. You could play with these. Not something we're going to get into in a 101 class though, but just so you're aware. Then the next tab over is called Manual. And that's where we can try to correct for the fact that I've tilted this a little bit. There's an area in here called Upright. And Upright has a total of 4 choices. The 5th choice on the far left means it's turned off. It's like a no symbol. The A stands for Auto, meaning it'll figure out what to do without you having to really make any decision on it. But let's see what it does when I click on the letter A. Do you see how I just tried to straighten the building? And it's not going to just rotate the building. If this is a building where I've tilted up in order to get it, and the top of the building looks smaller than the bottom, it's going to straighten the building. So the sides, instead of being tilted, are going to go straight up like that, if it's possible. Then we have some other choices, because Auto doesn't always do a good job. And so the other choices that are here, the one to the right of that will look only at horizontals in the building. And it will try to get them to be straight. And it won't care if the verticals are going in as it goes towards the top. But it's going to make sure the top and the bottom of your building is level. Because if you have a skyscraper, sometimes you want it to look like a really tall building. You want the top to look a lot smaller than the bottom to exaggerate the height. But you want the top and bottom of the building to be level. You don't want it to be off kilter, so you could use that. The one next to that is going to make sure only that verticals are corrected for it, that they end up being straight on. And that's useful if you shot something at an angle, but not shooting up of a kind of angle, but off to the side. And you want it to look like you shot it from off to the side, so that whatever's furthest away is smaller and all that. But you want the vertical lines that are there to not be at odd angles. So that could be useful. Or the last one corrects for both horizontals and verticals. And so that means get those verticals and horizontals to be straight. And on some images, that'll look really weird. So you really got to try it out. Start with Auto, and if you don't like it, then force it into one of the other settings. Below that, you have a bunch of sliders if you want to manually do things. If I want to make this look like a skyscraper, so it's really tall, then you could do it manually here. Not something you have to use all the time, but on occasion, it's just nice that it's there if you wanted to tweak it a little bit. Like if I had a skyscraper and I don't want to completely get rid of the distortion going towards the top, but I want to lessen it a little bit, you can do it there. So anyway, that is something that was used on that particular image to go from one that was kind of off kilter a little bit to one that felt more straight. Another one where that was used is this one. If you look at this particular one, I believe there's a parked car sitting right where I'd want to stand if I was going to shoot this more straight on. And so I'm going to again go to the Lens Corrections tab. Remember, that's this one here. It's supposed to look like a lens sliced down the middle where you can see the individual pieces of glass it's made out of. And in there, I'm going to hit the letter A. And it tried to line things up. I can try the others. See how it can look weird on some of them if it completely tries to straighten things out. But if I were to crop this where all we had was this little plaque and didn't have the other elements in there, it might be semi-usable. So in this case, I'm just going to start off with maybe auto. Now when it did that, you notice how there's some checkerboard showing up? That's just showing you where the edge of your picture ends. And due to the correction that it did, that's the shape your picture ended up turning up. Now we have to crop it. So I just grab the crop tool, click and drag on my image, and I'm just going to bring this in to get rid of the checkerboard stuff and get rid of anything that's a distraction. Like down here is a little element near the bottom. I'll bring it up just beyond it. On the left side, there's a door over there and other things. I'll try to bring it in to get rid of those distractions. There's even a shadow underneath that box where I can see a little detail on the edge. I'll bring it up just to get rid of that. I always try to clean up the edges as much as possible. Maybe there. Then I can switch to my hand tool. And so there's my kind of cleaned up cropping of the image. And let's see here. So just kind of rotated it a bit. I'm going to click cancel so we can keep the original, so you can compare this to this. And you see I did more extreme cropping on this one because this wasn't really, I try to concentrate on what's interesting. And if there's something that caused my eye to pick up my camera and try to shoot it, I try to isolate that as much as I can. And so I'll do a lot more cropping than some people will, but that gets it more down to just what I wanted. And then once I get it cropped like that, it's a matter of thinking about what's distracting the image. Can I retouch it out? Can I crop it out? Can I darken it? Can I make it less colorful or less detailed? And in this case, this sign right here was so blatant that I didn't like the picture, so I darkened the heck out of it. You can barely see it down there. That's most likely the adjustment brush. I use the adjustment brush. You see how I just switched to the adjustment brush, and you see all those circles? Each one of those circles indicates a separate adjustment. And so if I come down to the one that is near the sign, if you just hover over it without clicking, it will highlight what part of the picture was affected. And if you click on it, you're actually editing it then. And over here, you'll see what was done. The highlights were brought down to darken them. The exposure was brought down to darken them. It was less colorful. Clarity is being applied to the rest of the image to make it pop, make this not pop. So that type of stuff was done. If I hadn't done that, I'll just hit the delete key and it'll get rid of that adjustment. You can see how bright that used to be. Then these little lamps that are up here, if I mouse over this one, you see each lamp is highlighted. Click on it, you can see a kind of adjustment I'm making. I'm making it warmer, more towards yellow. I'm making the highlights brighter, meaning brighten up so it's a little more light in there. And add clarity. Clarity means make it pop. And if I were to get rid of that by hitting the delete key, watch those two lamps at the top. See how dull they looked? Because I thought they were interesting elements. Over here, you see an area highlighted. I click on it. That's bringing my highlights down and my saturation down. Meaning darken the bright stuff and make it less colorful. If I hit delete to get rid of it, watch the upper left corner. It's a very subtle thing there. Hard to see. Another spot there, also bringing the highlights down. I'll hit delete. You see that bright spot? Just trying to get my attention away. Over here, it's a whole area. I don't know if you saw that little bar, but it was area on the left. This is also bringing the highlights down. It might have been something I cropped out where I had done it before doing the cropping, so you can't see much of it. Down here at the bottom, same thing, highlights and clarity. And you see it was just a little area down there where my attention was being drawn. So hopefully that gives you some idea for how I'm using Camera Raw to work on isolated areas, and also how I correct for those kinds of distortion. Do we have any questions about that before we move on?
Rick Strobaugh and one other person wanted to know, with cropping, especially extreme cropping, don't you lessen the size you can enlarge a photo for printing compared to framing the shot you want in the camera initially?
Yes, and that's part of the reason why the camera I shoot with is 22 or 24 megapixels instead of 16. That's one of the things that a higher megapixel camera gives you, is the ability to crop. Higher megapixels means you have more pixels. Megapixel just means millions of pixels. So if you were to take the width and multiply it by the height in pixels, you'd get how many pixels you have total. And if you have a million, you have a 1 megapixel image kind of thing. It just means how much stuff you got. The higher that is, the larger of a print you can make because you got more information, or the more you can crop into it. And it's one reason why I like to have a relatively high resolution camera, so I have that flexibility.